bold but not cruel, wise but unlearned, writing no books but singing many songs. Maya, Govan and Melyn, and welcome to another Tolkien Untangled Top 10 list. Today I will be talking about 10 of my favourite men and women from among the Horse Lords of Rohan. Number 10. Morwen Steelsheen. Alright, so I am starting off by cheating a little bit, because technically Morwen Steelsheen is not a Lady of Rohan, but she does marry a King of Rohan, and in so doing she becomes the mother of future King Théoden, and thus the grandmother of Théodred, Éomer, and Éowyn. And the reason Morwen Steelsheen is so important to talk about in regards to the men of Rohan is precisely because she is not a man of Rohan. Morwen Steelsheen was originally a woman of Gondor, but not the part of Gondor that we probably think of when we hear that word. Morwen was not from Minas Tirith or Osgiliath or Ithilien or anywhere like that. She is a woman of Belfalas, right on Gondor's southern coast. And if you've seen any of my previous videos where I talk about Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, then you'll know that within the royal line of Dunedain princes in this region, their heritage is enriched by a little bit of elven blood. 1,000 years before the Lord of the Rings, the first prince of Dol Amroth was a half-elf called Galador, son of Imrazor the Númenorian and Mithralas the Sylvan elf of Lothlorien. And Morwen is a direct descendant of Galador, which means that although she is mostly one of Gondor's southern Dunedain, she does have a little bit of elvish blood in her veins. And this trace of elvish descent is passed on to her son Théoden. It's rarely talked about, but Théoden, as well as Théodred and Éowyn and Éomer, are very distantly descended from a wood elf of Lothlorien. But there's more, because when Morwen married Théoden's father, Thengel was not yet Rohan's king, and so the two of them lived together in Gondor. Théoden was born in Gondor, and there he grew up speaking Sindarin. So, although it is a very easy thing to gloss over, I think it's very cool to consider that although Théoden is a man of Rohan in every way that counts, he was in fact born in Gondor, and he grew up speaking the language of Gondor, and his mother was a woman of the Dunedain, and the direct descendant of a half-elf. And so the same is of course true for Éomer and Éowyn, the children of Théoden's sister. And this is something that's noted upon by Tolkien. In The Lord of the Rings, we are told that Éomer was taller than all the rest, and in the Unfinished Tales this is elaborated upon. Éomer was said to have been tall, of like height with Aragorn, which is about 6'6", deriving his characteristic from Morwen of Gondor of high Númenorian descent. Number 9. King Brego, the second king of Rohan. So, Brego began ruling Rohan 435 years before Théoden did, and he was the son of one of the most important people in all of Rohan's history, Eorl the Young, but more about him in a minute. Anyway, it was during the reign of King Brego that Rohan began to become what it was during the time of the Lord of the Rings. It was Brego who built the Golden Hall of Meduseld, from which all future kings would rule. It was Brego who made Edoras the capital of the kingdom, and it was Brego who rid his new realm of the last remnants of the orcs and of the Sauron-worshipping men who called themselves the Balchoth. And there's another very cool detail about Brego, or perhaps I should say Brego's son, because when Brego completed the construction of Meduseld, he inaugurated his Golden Hall with a great feast. And it was at this feast that Brego's son, Baldur, made a very foolish vow. He announced to all the people in Meduseld that he would journey up the haunted mountain pass and venture through the Gate of the Dead. So, as you probably know, to the south of Edoras are the White Mountains, and one of these mountains in particular has a particularly terrifying reputation among the men of Rohan, Dwimmerberg, the Haunted Mountain, a place where living men fear to go. But, in his arrogance, Baldur set off on the Dimholt road anyway, and he journeyed all the way up to the Black Door, or the Gate of the Dead, and then he was never seen or heard from again. His father Brego died of grief only a year later, and his younger brother Aldor became the third king of Rohan. But what's very cool about this is that we actually get a clue to Baldur's fate 500 years later in The Return of the King, when Aragorn and the Grey Company take the same mountain pass and come themselves to the Gate of the Dead. And there we are told that Aragorn beheld the skeleton of a golden-clad knight with a broken sword and broken legs. Now, in the published Lord of the Rings, we're not explicitly told that this long-dead knight is Baldur, son of Brego, but in Tolkien's earlier drafts of the story, he did actually confirm this. And he used some incredibly creepy language to describe Baldur's last moments of life. So bear in mind that this was cut from the final draft, so whether or not it's canon is kind of up to you, but Tolkien did once write that the special horror of the closed door before which the skeleton of Baldur was found was probably due to the fact that the door was the entrance to an evil temple. But the door was shut in his face, and his enemies that had followed him silently came up and broke his legs and left him to die in the darkness. It would appear that Tolkien intended for Baldur to have been a victim of the Oath Breakers, and a warning of the fate that awaited Aragorn and the Grey Company, if not for the fact that he was Isildur's heir. Number 8. Eorl the Young. So, Eorl was the father of Brego, and also the first ever king of Rohan. The story of Eorl is the story of Rohan's founding. So, before Eorl, the lands of Rohan were a part of eastern Gondor called Calenarthon. And the people of the Rohirrm were a group of horse lords who back then called themselves the Eotheod. And they lived in the vales between the river Anduin and the forest of Mirkwood, where their ancestors fought orcs and dragons, and they even joined the alliance that defeated the Witch King of Angmar's invasion of the north. However, the story of Rohan begins with a 16-year-old lord called Eorl, son of Leod. But by the time Eorl becomes significant, his father is already dead. He was killed while trying to be the first mortal ever to tame one of the Maeras, the semi-divine horses that can trace their descent to the steed of the Valar Orome. And the horse in question is called Felaroth. However, when Leod approached Felaroth and tried to tame him, Felaroth kicked Leod in the head and killed him. And so, among the first things that Eorl does in this story is to successfully accomplish what his father could not. He tamed Felaroth. He named him Mansbane, and he demanded that the horse submit to him and bear him for the rest of its life as a weregild for his father's death. And it seems that Felaroth deemed Eorl worthy, because forever after, Eorl rode upon one of the Maeras, a direct ancestor of Shadowfax in fact. Eorl and Felaroth became the first ever pairing of Maeras and mortal man. And the reason that all of this is significant is because it is upon Felaroth that Eorl first rides into the lands of Calenarthon. But before we can get to that, first I need to talk a little bit about what Gondor was up to in this period. You see, as is almost always the case, Gondor was at war. And this time, their enemy was a group of evil men known as the Balchoth. Their ancestors had come from the east, but it was from Dol Guldur that they issued, under the command of the Necromancer. And alongside orcs, the Balchoth overran eastern Gondor and they cut off the Gondorian army that had marched out to meet them. Every day their ranks were swelled by orcs of the Misty Mountains, and an already weakened Gondor teetered on the brink of ruin. So, the ruling steward of Gondor, whose name was Cirion, he sent 6 riders out into the north to seek aid from the men of Rhovanion. 5 of these riders were slain, but 1 survived, and his name was Borondir. After 15 days, the exhausted and near-starved Borondir came to Eorl the Young, and he handed him the seal of Steward Cirion and a red arrow. And this red arrow is a very important part of Middle-earth's history, because although this isn't how it goes in the movies, if we skip forward 500 years for a moment to the Lord of the Rings books, we will see another Gondorian rider coming in haste to the men of Rohan and delivering to King Théoden another red arrow. For centuries, the red arrow is a symbol of friendship and summons between the rulers of Gondor and the rulers of the Eotheod. As you know, when Théoden is presented with the red arrow in The Lord of the Rings, he musters his Rohirrm and rides to the defence of Minas Tirith and to their rescue at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. And he does this knowing that his direct ancestor Eorl the Young, the first king of Rohan, did the exact same thing back at the beginning of Rohan's history. He rode south to do battle with the Balchoth for the sake of defending Gondor. Which brings us to the Battle of the Field of Celebrant. Gondor's steward, Cirion, had 2 armies at this time, a northern one and a southern one, but during the fighting these 2 forces were cut off from each other, and they were outnumbered and outmatched by the Balchoth. All seemed lost and hopeless, but then Eorl arrived on Felaroth, and with him rode Borondir and 7,000 horsemen of the Eotheod. The Balchoth were overrun and hunted to the last by Eorl's horsemen, and so the battle was won. Gondor was saved, and in honour of Eorl's coming, Steward Cirion swore a solemn oath to the Eotheod that is remembered as the Oath of Eorl. Eorl swore to Cirion that his descendants would forever be friends to Gondor, and would forever ride to battle when Gondor needed them. And in return, Cirion gave up the eastern lands of Calanarthon and transferred their rule to Eorl and his descendants. Thus, in the year 2510 of the Third Age, Eastern Gondor became forever after the Kingdom of Rohan, and Eorl ruled as its first king. Number 7. Helm Hammerhand. Okay, so fast forward 231 years from the Battle of Celebrant, and we will arrive at the 9th king of Rohan, Helm Hammerhand, who was born 328 years before the Lord of the Rings. And it is for King Helm Hammerhand that Helm's Deep is named. You see, during the time of King Helm and King Helm's father, Rohan was at war with their long-term enemies, the Dunlendings, the wild men of Dunland, who had, at this point in the story, conquered Isengard and claimed it for their own. Saruman wasn't yet on the scene. And a major player in this Rohirrm Dunlending conflict is a lord called Freke, who is technically a man of Rohan and a direct descendant of Rohan's 5th king, Freawine, but he was also descended from the lords of the Dunlendings, and his lands lay outside of Rohan in southern Dunland. Now, Freke had a son called Wulf, and it was Freke's intention for Wulf to marry the daughter of King Helm. But Helm refused. He rebuffed Freke, he called him fat, and not long after, he punched Freke so hard in the face that Freke died. And thus, due to his incredible strength, Helm became known as Helm Hammerhand. Wulf was declared an enemy of Rohan, and 4 years later, he began his Dunlending invasion. And just like many of the Dunlendings in the later War of the Ring, Wulf's armies fought the Rohirrim of Rohan at the fords of Isen, where Helm's forces were soundly defeated and many were slain. Wulf and his Dunlendings swiftly overran the country of Rohan, and they even conquered the capital of Edoras. At the door of the Golden Hall of Meduseld, Wulf killed Helm's eldest son, Haleth, and he declared himself King Wulf of all Rohan. Helm Hammerhand and his surviving son, along with what remained of his riders, fled to the Hornburg, which back then was called the Soothburg, and there they were besieged throughout the long winter. For 5 months, Rohan was gripped by ice and snow, and the situation became more and more desperate for the Rohirrm loyal to Helm. Against Helm's orders, his second son, Hummer, rode out of the Hornburg in a sortie to do battle with the Dunlendings, but he was lost in the snow and he never returned. Helm was consumed by grief, but he did not die of it. We are told that in the Hornburg, Helm would blow his great horn, and it would fill the Dunlendings with dread. And on occasion he would venture beyond his stronghold in secret, clad in white and armed only with his deadly fists. He would stalk his enemies like a snow troll and slay them with his bare hands. Until, one night, Helm did not return. Cold and famine had claimed him, but his body was later found frozen solid and still standing upright, still ready to fight. According to legends told among the Rohirrm, even after his death, the wraith of Helm Hammerhand still stalked the lands of Rohan, and his horn could still be heard in Helm's Deep. In fact, it was for that reason that the Hornburg took its name. Number 6. Freylaf Hildason. So, Freylaf was the 10th king of Rohan and the nephew of Helm Hammerhand. But whereas his uncle Helm's story ends pretty tragically, with his kingdom still under the usurped rule of King Wulf, Freylaf is the one who ends that war. He is the one who liberates his kingdom and reclaims his throne. While King Helm sought sanctuary in the Hornburg, Freylaf and his mother found refuge in the ancient cliff top of Dunharrow. But in the spring, after the long winter that claimed the life of Helm, Freylaf launched a daring surprise raid against the Dunlendings in Edoras, where he eventually succeeded in reclaiming his capital, and there he avenged his uncle by slaying the usurper Wulf. With the aid of his Gondorian allies, Freylaf led his Rohirrm all the way to Isengard, and it became their turn to do the besieging. The Dunlendings locked themselves away within the impenetrable tower of Orthanc, but eventually starvation forced them to capitulate, surrender, and return to their own lands. And I think this bitter conflict with the Dunlendings is an important backstory in understanding Rohan's conflict with Isengard during the War of the Ring. Because although the Dunlendings are only briefly shown in the Lord of the Rings movies, they are a very important part of Saruman's armies in the books. A large faction of angry Dunlendings fight alongside the Wolves and Uruk-hai at Helm's Deep. And although many surrender after that battle and their lives are spared by the Rohirrm, there are many others who still remain loyal to Saruman. It was almost certainly the men of Dunland who were used in Saruman's experiments to create half-orcs, and even right at the very end of the story, during the scouring of the Shire, most of Saruman's ruffians were former men of Dunland. I believe the reason that so many of these men were corrupted by Saruman is because he was able to manipulate and use their historical animosity towards the men of Rohan for his own ends. And speaking of Saruman, there is a foreboding little epilogue to mention in regards to Freylaf's story, because after the expulsion of the Dunlendings from Isengard, Freylaf was crowned king. But at his coronation, a stranger appeared after many, many years of absence. And this stranger is, of course, Saruman. He presents himself as a friend to the men of Rohan, and after the devastation of the war and the long winter, King Freylaf welcomes him. And upon Freylaf's advice, the steward of Gondor gives to Saruman the keys of Orthanc. But as we all know, in only a few short centuries, Saruman would go on to do great evil to his neighbours in Rohan, and he also brought great evil to his pawns in Dunland. Both realms of men deserve a lot better than a despicably treacherous wizard for a friend.
Number 5.
Elfhelm and Grimbold. So these guys are a 2-for-1. Elfhelm and Grimbold are both epic characters who play a very important behind-the-scenes role in the Lord of the Rings story. So in most adaptations of Tolkien's books, Gandalf arrives at the Battle of the Hornburg with Éomer and a bunch of his reinforcements. But in Tolkien's writings, this whole subplot is massively more complex, and it isn't Éomer who Gandalf rides with. In the books, Éomer was at Helm's Deep from the beginning. Instead, Gandalf arrives at the battle with Grimbold and a guy called Erkenbrand, while Elfhelm goes off and does his own thing in Edoras. But this is only the tip of the iceberg in Grimbold and Elfhelm's story. So, on the very same day that the Fellowship of the Ring passed the Argonath, a huge battle was taking place in the northwest of Rohan, at the Fords of Isen. And in this battle, at least 2,000 Dunlendings, Uruk-hai, and Wolf Riders attack the warriors of Théoden's son, Théodred. And I'll talk more about this in just a minute, but it is during that battle that Elfhelm and Grimbold both make their first appearance in the story. We are told that Elfhelm was a warrior of the capital, and when he received summons from Théodred, he rode north in great haste with 4 companies from the muster of Edoras, which is why there aren't a great deal of warriors in Edoras when Aragorn and Gandalf show up there just 1 week later. Anyway, tragically, Elfhelm does not arrive at the Fords of Isen until quite late into the night, and by then the battle was already well underway. Despite the wariness of himself and his riders, Elfhelm ordered them to charge straight into Saruman's armies and thus hopefully rescue Théodred from a certain death. Except, tragically, he was too late. Théodred was slain by a great orc man, and his valiant captain, Grimbold, was also very nearly slain. But Elfhelm and his riders were able to save Grimbold's life, and their arrival at the Fords of Isen ultimately ended the battle. Saruman's army retreated, and many were slaughtered by Elfhelm's riders, but this isn't quite the defeat for Saruman that it may at first glance appear to be. His army's entire mission was simply to kill Théodred. That is the only reason this battle happened, and in that mission, Saruman's forces were successful. Elfhelm and Grimbold defended Théodred's body, and it was to them that he spoke his final words. And after this, the riders of Rohan were in a pretty desperate situation. Technically, they had won, sort of, the first battle at the Fords of Isen, but it came at a heavy cost. Their prince was dead, their numbers were weakened, and now they were leaderless. Which brings us to that other guy I mentioned, Erkenbrand. Now, Erkenbrand was an old man of Rohan whose job it was to keep the fortress at Helm's Deep. But after the death of Théodred, he also became the new commander of the Westmark. And it was Erkenbrand who sent messages to Théoden in Edoras telling him that Théodred was dead, and to request that Éomer ride up to the Fords of Isen to reinforce Elfhelm and Grimbold and their defenders. However, this is all happening before the arrival of Aragorn and Gandalf, and so Théoden is still very much under the sway of Grima Wormtongue. And Grima hid this message from the king so that the battle at the Fords of Isen and the death of Théodred were not made known in Edoras until after Gandalf had healed Théoden and Wormtongue had been banished. Unlike in the movies, Théoden and the remaining warriors of Edoras, along with Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, then pretty immediately ride away from the capital with the intention of heading north to meet up with Elfhelm and Grimbold and to attack Isengard. But on the road they are met by a rider called Chaol, who tells Théoden that on that very day there has just been another battle at the Fords of Isen, a second battle in which both Elfhelm and Grimbold are key players. This news convinces Théoden to change his plans, and knowing that an invasion was imminent, he rode instead to Helm's Deep. And thus he set the stage for the Battle of the Hornburg. But in the books, this is where Gandalf rides away. So, while Théoden and our main characters are preparing to defend the Hornburg, Elfhelm and Grimbold have just survived a devastating second assault by Saruman's forces at the Fords of Isen. During the fighting, Elfhelm and Grimbold were cut off from each other, and the fords were taken. Erkenbrand and his riders from the Hornburg rode out to aid them, but by the end of the day the defenders were scattered, and Saruman's army were marching south to Helm's Deep. And this is where Gandalf comes back into the story. During the night of the Battle of the Hornburg, Gandalf speeds through the northwest of Rohan, finding and uniting the companies of Elfhelm, Grimbold, and Erkenbrand. Elfhelm and his warriors are sent back to Edoras to defend the capital, while Erkenbrand and Grimbold ride with Gandalf and 1,000 men of the Westfold to break the siege at Helm's Deep and bring victory to the king and the people of Rohan. But this isn't even the last that we see of Grimbold and Elfhelm in The Lord of the Rings. When Gondor called for aid, both Grimbold and Elfhelm were among the riders of Théoden who went to Pelennor Fields, and in that battle, Grimbold was slain. However, Elfhelm was not. Tolkien tells us that Elfhelm was one of the only riders of Rohan who knew that Merry the Hobbit was secretly riding among them, but he ordered his men to ignore Merry and to allow him to ride among them. And at the Battle of Pelennor Fields, he rode on the opposite flank to Grimbold, and unlike his friend, he survived. After the destruction of the ring, Elfhelm remained a high captain of the Rohirrm, and he was even a chief witness at the coronation of Aragorn himself. I fully understand why the Elfhelm and Grimbold storyline was condensed and given to Éomer in the movies and in most other adaptations, but these two lesser-known warriors of Rohan are such an amazing detail and such a great reminder that there is always so much more going on in Middle-earth than just what our main characters are up to.
Number 4.
Theodred. So, now that we're all familiar with Elfhelm and Grimbold, it is time to talk about the guy they served, Theodred, son of King Théoden. And although Theodred is already dead in the books by the time our main characters arrive in Edoras, his story is an incredibly important part of Rohan's story during the War of the Ring. During his lifetime, Theodred served as the second Marshal of the Riddermark, which is the highest military command after the king, the first Marshal. However, as we all know, during the latter years of Theodred's life, Théoden was manipulated and weakened and potentially poisoned by Grima Wormtongue. So the de facto leader of Rohan's riders was Theodred. And the thing that I love most about Theodred is the fact that from Saruman's perspective, Theodred was the greatest challenge to be overcome. Saruman knew that Rohan simply could not be conquered as long as Theodred lived. He was a mighty rider, a great warrior, a beloved prince, and a worthy future king. As Théoden grew weaker, Theodred became the main source of Rohan's resistance. But there is another character to talk about here, and that is Theodred's beloved younger cousin, Éomer, the third Marshal of the Riddermark, and the other great leader who kept his country from the brink of ruin. And so, Saruman's entire strategy began to revolve around ridding Rohan of Theodred and Éomer. He ordered his puppet, Grima Wormtongue, to try and discredit Theodred and Éomer in the eyes of King Théoden, but this didn't work in the slightest, because Theodred and Éomer were simply too loyal. Even in his feeble state, Théoden could not be convinced that either his son or his nephew would ever turn against him. And so, Wormtongue changed his strategy, and he began to try and convince Theodred that Éomer was not to be trusted. He tried to turn the cousins against each other, but once again, this was utterly futile. Théoden loved and respected Éomer, and Éomer loved and respected him so much. And I think there's an interesting comparison to be made between how Théoden and Éomer expected their futures to go and what actually ended up happening. Obviously, Éomer is only the nephew of the king, whereas Théoden is the king's son. So, from the beginning of Éomer's life, he must have expected for Théoden to succeed Théoden as king, while he would fight and potentially die in the armies of Rohan. Théoden was the heir, Éomer was the warrior. Except, of course, that's not what actually ended up happening. After Théoden's death, it was Éomer who took up his uncle's crown, and it was Théoden who was fated to die in the defense of his country. So, when Saruman's forces began threatening an invasion of Rohan, it was Théoden who took control of mustering the Rohirrm. And at Helm's Deep, he gathered the military strength of both Edoras, led by Elfhelm, and the Westfold, led by Erkenbrand. Théoden rode with his captain Grimbold and the rest of the Rohirrm to fight Saruman's forces at the fords of Isen, but as I've already mentioned, this force of Saruman's was not sent to, cross the fords or begin an invasion of Rohan. They had only one objective: kill Théoden, no matter the cost. And thus began the first battle at the fords of Isen. This is the one that I talked about a moment ago, where Elfhelm's riders arrived too late, and as he arrived and rushed to his prince's side, Théoden was hewn down by a great orc man. The orc was slain by Grimbold, and Grimbold was saved by Elfhelm, but there was nothing that could be done for Théoden. As soon as he was felled, Saruman's warband retreated back to their master, kind of victorious. Grimbold and Elfhelm lifted Théoden's body, and as they did so they found that he was still breathing, but only long enough to utter his final words. "Lie me here, to keep the fords, till Éomer comes." And then Théoden died, leaving the fate of Rohan to his weakened father and his warrior cousin.
Number 3.
King Théoden. I would say there is no king in Middle-earth who suffered more from Saruman's treachery than Théoden, but there is also no king who played a greater role in that wizard's undoing. I feel like the trajectory of Théoden's life is great prowess being worn away into weakness, but then that weakness being redeemed back into great prowess. When we first meet Théoden in The Lord of the Rings, he is feeble and sickly, but at the beginning of his life he was truly mighty, and at the end of his life he is mighty again. As I mentioned at the beginning of this list, Théoden was actually born in Gondor to a Gondorian mother of Númenorian descent, and so in his youth Théoden would have grown up speaking Sindarin, Westron, that's the common tongue, and also Rohirric. But everything began to go downhill for Théoden when his wife Elfhild died, giving birth to Théoden. Over the years, his health began to fail, and Grima Wormtongue became more and more influential in his life. And although in the movies Théoden's sickness is directly stated to be a result of Saruman's magic, in the books it's a little bit more ambiguous. Although it is implied that Grima Wormtongue exacerbated the king's illness by secretly feeding him poison and keeping him uninformed about the goings-on in his kingdom. But then Gandalf the White arrives in Edoras, and due to his intervention, Théoden is healed and returned to full strength. After Wormtongue's banishment, Théoden releases Éomer from his imprisonment, and again, unlike in the movies, he rides off on the very day that Gandalf arrived to do battle with Saruman's army. However, as I've already mentioned, on the road to Isengard, Théoden encounters that rider of Théodred's, Ceol, who warns him that the fords have fallen, and so Théoden changes his plans, and instead of riding with his warriors to Isengard, he decides to take a stand at Helm's Deep. After his victory in the Battle of the Hornburg, Théoden takes the epithet Ednu, which means the renewed, as he has now utterly thrown off the yoke of Saruman. And in the Two Towers movie, this is pretty much the climax of the story. But in the Two Towers book, there are 4 more chapters of content in which Théoden rides to Isengard to have his first and final confrontation with the treasonous Saruman. But although Saruman's military might is now vanquished, he does still wield his greatest weapon, his voice. When Théoden and Saruman speak at the Tower of Orthanc, Saruman uses his magically persuasive voice to try and manipulate Théoden back into his dotage. He uses his enchanting voice to say to Théoden, "O worthy son of Thengel, the thrice renowned, why have you not come before and as a friend? Much have I desired to see you, mightiest king of western lands. Indeed, I alone can aid you now." Now, to this, Théoden opens his mouth to speak, but he hesitates and says nothing. Saruman is then insulted by Gimli, of all people, but he pivots the conversation back to Théoden, and he calls him a neighbour and a friend. He says, "What have you to say, Théoden King? Will you have peace with me?" But again, Théoden doesn't answer. This time it is Éomer's turn to insult Saruman, and he mentions the burning of the Westfold and the murder of Theodred and the brutally dishonourable killing of Théoden's old door warden, a guy called Hummer, who died in the Battle of the Hornburg, before his dead body was savagely hacked to pieces by Saruman's Uruk-hai. But again, Théoden says nothing. Saruman straight up denies being a murderer, and he says for the 3rd time, "Théoden King, shall we have peace and friendship, you and I?" And then, finally, Théoden answers him. "We will have peace," he says. "Yes, we will have peace. We will have peace when you and all your works have perished. You are a liar, Saruman. What will you say of the tortures in Westfold and the children that lie dead there? How they hewed Hummer's body before the gates of the Hornburg after he was dead. When you hang from a gibbet at your window for the sport of your own crows, I will have peace." And I think this moment is what Théoden's whole character has been building to. In his first appearance in the story, Théoden is described as so bent with age that he seemed almost a dwarf. But in his final description, we are told that the battle fury of his fathers ran like new fire in his veins, and he was borne up like a god of old, even as Orome the Great in the Battle of the Valar. Théoden's character arc is magnificent. But of course, this story does not end with the Two Towers. Just like his ancestor Eorl the Young, Théoden is also presented with a red arrow from a rider of Gondor, and he too fulfills the oath of Eorl and rides to the aid of Minas Tirith in its darkest hour. And due to Théoden's arrival, Minas Tirith is spared from utter destruction, and although Théoden is slain in that battle, his actions ensure the eventual downfall of Sauron only 10 days later. In less than a fortnight, Théoden went from being Saruman's thrall to a hero of Pelennor Fields, one of the greatest kings of the Third Age, and living proof that it is never too late to be an absolute badass.
Number 2.
Éomer Eadig. So, Éomer is of course the son of Théoden's sister, Théodwen, and her husband, a nobleman of Rohan called Éomund. But when Éomer was only 11 years old, his father was killed by orcs of the Emyn Muil, and his mother died of sickness not long after. And so Éomer and his sister Éowyn were adopted by their uncle the king, and raised as his own in Meduseld. However, as Théoden slipped further into weakness, and as Grima Wormtongue gained more and more power, Meduseld was no longer a safe place for Éomer. Grima constantly fed lies to the king that Éomer was unfaithful, and that he planned to usurp the king's rightful heir, Theodred. Now, as I've already said, that was an absolute deception. Éomer was never anything but insanely loyal, but tragically, he was unable to save his cousin, Theodred. and the day after the battle in which Théoden died, Éomer learned that there was another warband of orcs travelling through Rohan on their way to Isengard, this time from the east. Fearing a union between Isengard and Mordor, Éomer prepared his Eored to ride out and to exterminate these orcs, but under Grima Wormtongue's malicious influence, Théoden ordered that Éomer remain in Edoras. And so for the first time in his entire life, Éomer disobeyed his king's command. And it's a good thing that he did, because although Éomer had no way of knowing it, the orcs that he and his riders were hunting were of course the orcs who were carrying Merry and Pippin to Isengard. As I'm sure we all know, these orcs were harried by Éomer's riders in the night, and when the sun rose, the orcs were slaughtered. In fact, Éomer himself was the one to kill the Uruk's chieftain, Ugluk, in single combat. Later that day, Éomer and his riders encountered Aragorn, and after a little bit of conflict, he gave the three hunters a pair of horses and let them go about their business. But he made them promise to return the horses to Edoras when their mission was accomplished. However, when Éomer and his surviving riders returned to Edoras, he was not well received. As penalty for breaking his king's command, Éomer was arrested and imprisoned on the order of Grima Wormtongue. But luckily, Éomer only actually spent one full day in prison, and that is because of the promise that he made Aragorn swear to him when he gave him a pair of horses. Aragorn swiftly returned the horses to Edoras, and when he did, he brought with him Gandalf the White. After Wormtongue's banishment, Éomer was released, and unlike in the movies, he remained with Théoden and rode with him to fight alongside him in the Battle of the Hornburg. And there he would have been killed if not for the axe of Gimli. After the Battle of the Hornburg, Éomer accompanied his king to Isengard, and then on the fields of Pelennor, he fought in the defence of Minas Tirith. And as you all know, in the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Théoden is slain, and Éowyn is very nearly slain too. Again, unlike in the movies, Éomer is present when this happens, and he rides over to his mortally wounded king, and in Théoden's final words, he hails Éomer as the new King of the Mark. He says, "Ride now to victory, bid Éowyn farewell," and then he dies. And in the midst of battle, Éomer becomes king. And the first thing he sees is what he believes to be his dead sister, Éowyn. His face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him. And without waiting for reinforcements from Minas Tirith, Éomer rode out against the remaining enemy, slaying all in his path and shouting the iconic line, "Death, ride, ride to ruin and the world's ending." Éomer and his riders fought Mumakil and Haradrim and Easterlings and Orcs and Variags of Khand, but eventually the battle turned ill, and it seemed that Éomer would die on the very same field as his uncle and his sister, and the line of Rohan's kings would be wiped out. He looked to the river and saw black ships, and he despaired that the Corsairs had come and the battle was indeed lost. And so Éomer laughed, and he prepared himself for death. But then, in one of the most epic moments in the entire story, the black ships of the Corsairs raise their standards, and Éomer beholds a white tree, and thus arrives Aragorn with a company of reinforcements. Just as Aragorn predicted a little earlier in the story, he and Éomer meet each other again in the midst of battle, two kings united in war. After the Battle of Pelennor Fields, King Éomer joins the captains of the West in the battle at the Black Gate, and after their final victory, Éomer and Aragorn renewed the Oath of Eorl and swore everlasting friendship between their respective kingdoms. Éomer became known as Éomer Eadig, which means the Blessed, and he went on to marry a lady called Lothiriel, the daughter of Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, and thus, just like Eomer's grandmother, Morwen Steelsheen, she was a Gondorian woman of Númenorian descent. Together they had a son named Elfwine the Fair, and he succeeded his father after Eomer's death at the age of 93. Throughout the rest of his life, Eomer continued his friendship with Meriadoc Brandybuck, and in the last year of his life, he requested that Merry and Pippin journey south once again to be with him when he died.
Number 1.
Éowyn, the Lady of Rohan. So Éowyn is my favourite person in all of Rohan's history. She has one of the most wonderful stories in all of The Lord of the Rings, and I think she only gets better and better the more I reread it. Although I will say that Éowyn is one of those characters who is portrayed really quite differently in the movies to how she is written in the books. For example, Miranda Otto was 35 when the Two Towers movie was released, and throughout that movie she spends most of her time swooning over Aragorn and making really bad stew. Now, I don't want to imply that Éowyn's feelings for Aragorn were completely made up by Peter Jackson. They totally do exist in Tolkien's writings, but they aren't the main conflict of Éowyn's story. They aren't at the core of her character. And there really are two crucial things to point out when comparing Tolkien's Éowyn to Peter Jackson's. Firstly, and incredibly importantly, is the fact that book Éowyn is not 35 years old. She's 23. Apart from the very minor character Berygil and maybe a few child hobbits, Éowyn is the youngest named character in the entire Lord of the Rings. And I certainly think this changes the way I look at her unrequited feelings for Aragorn. I mean, what 23-year-old wouldn't want Aragorn to notice them? But the other thing to be made aware of is that in the Two Towers book, Éowyn isn't really in it very much, like at all. We first meet her when Gandalf and the Three Hunters first come to Edoras to heal Théoden, and she and Aragorn do have a moment of prolonged eye contact, and she hands him a cup in a very meaningful way, but that's pretty much it. In the books, Théoden and his riders make for Helm's Deep on the very same day that Gandalf heals him, but unlike in the movies, they are not going to Helm's Deep as an act of retreat, they are riding out to do war. Helm's Deep is closer to Isengard than Edoras is, and so in the book neither Éowyn nor any women or children go with them. In fact, Théoden tells all of Meduseld that if both he and Éomer are killed in the coming war, then Éowyn is to take up the throne and become Rohan's first ruling queen, the final survivor of the royal house of Eorl. But then our main characters ride away from Edoras and Éowyn watches them leave, and we don't see her again until the second chapter of The Return of the King. So in this scene, just before Aragorn takes the paths of the dead, he and Éowyn have a meaningful conversation in both the books and in the movies. The location and the timing of their conversation is a little bit different, but I don't think those changes are too big of a deal. What is a big deal, though, is the massive change in dynamic between Aragorn's character and Éowyn's character, and it irritates me so much. In the movies, Éowyn comes to Aragorn as he's getting ready to go, and she kind of tells him off for leaving on the eve of battle. But then almost immediately the conversation becomes all about Éowyn's love and how Aragorn can't give her what she seeks, and we see Éowyn tearing up and backing away, and the exchange very much just ends on a note of Aragorn rejecting Éowyn and him walking away from her while she cries and watches him go. That is so different from how this scene goes in the books. As I've already said, Éowyn in the books is only 23, and this is the first conversation that she and Aragorn have properly had in the whole story. Also, it takes place back in Meduseld. Théoden and Éomer and most of the rest of the Rohirrm are still away near Isengard, and Aragorn is accompanied by Elrond's twin sons, Legolas, Gimli, and 30 Dunedain Rangers who call themselves the Grey Company. So, in the books, Éowyn comes to Aragorn not as a tearful woman looking for a boyfriend, but as the young ruler of her ancestors' Golden Hall. Théoden and Éomer still haven't returned, so she is effectively the queen, and Aragorn is a guest in her capital. When she comes to greet them, she is mind blown that Aragorn has such a variety of other powerful beings who love him enough that they would follow him wherever he led them. But even in the company of Elrond's sons, it is Aragorn who Éowyn is drawn to. However, unrequited love is not the theme that Tolkien used this conversation to explore. In my mind, this is a conversation about one of the absolute most sensual themes in The Lord of the Rings, and that is the long defeat. To an extent, Éowyn represents despair in this moment and the perceived inevitability of death and defeat. And because she is so young and brash, the central idea that drives her character is that it's better to die in glorious battle with the men than to die alone in an empty home. She says her whole thing about fearing neither death nor pain, and the only thing she fears is a cage, and she fiercely tells Aragorn that she is a shield maiden who can fight, so he should take her with him to war. However, Aragorn's central theme in this conversation is hope. As a child, his name was Estelle, which literally means hope. Aragorn is an embodiment of hope. And so, whereas Éowyn sees only death and defeat in her future, either in battle or in a cage, Aragorn sees a future where she could live happily as a great lady ruling over men in a time of peace. Which, if we skip forward to the end, is exactly what ends up happening. Éowyn's characterization in the books is so much deeper than just loving a guy who doesn't love her back, and I think the movies really miss out on an opportunity to portray all the complexities of this great character. Anyway, after this scene, in both the books and the movies, Éowyn rides in secret to Pelennor Fields with the Rohirrm. Although, in the books, even Merry doesn't know that this Dernhelm dude is actually Éowyn in disguise. It's not until she removes her helm and kills the Witch King that Tolkien reveals Éowyn has been among the Rohirrm this whole time. And after the battle, Éowyn is tended in the Houses of Healing, and it's there that she meets Faramir, and the two eventually fall in love and become engaged. And Faramir is, of course, in many ways quite similar to Aragorn, but whereas Aragorn was the guy that Éowyn wanted, Faramir is the guy she needed. He's the one who finally reignites hope in Éowyn's character, and who shows her that there is more to life than a glorious death. And it is with Faramir that Éowyn spends the rest of her life after the story. She leaves Rohan under the kingship of her brother, and she relocates with her new husband to become the new White Lady of Ithilien. There she rules a Gondorian principality, she has a son called Elberon, and she maintains her friendship with Meriadoc Brandybuck. The reason I think that I like Éowyn so much is because she is such a unique character. There's so much more to her than just being a young lady in love with an unavailable man, but there is also so much more to her than just being a badass warrior woman. Éowyn is an amazingly three-dimensional character and an absolute pleasure to get to know over the course of The Lord of the Rings. So, there's my list of top 10 men of Rohan. Let me know if I missed any of your favourites, and of course, to make sure you don't miss any future lore videos or any of my Silmarillion explained videos, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to hit like and share this channel with your friends if you want to. But, as always, until next time, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy, and navaer melyn.